So today I wanted to talk about Sony and why they're so committed to single player games. I don't know if you guys saw the other week, Sony pretty much said they're committed to continuing delivering single player experiences to the PlayStation 5, which is due for a 2020 release. And I just think it's interesting thing to talk about. I think it's important to understand why in an industry that is moving towards the games as a service business model, the majority of AAA studios, including Bethesda Game Studios now, are getting in on it. And of course, this is something EA, Activision, and other big AAA companies have been promoting. Ubisoft is a good example. Rainbow Six Siege has been going on for 3 years, and it doesn't seem like they're going to be making a new Rainbow Six game anytime soon. Because why would they? The game keeps churning out money. People are still playing it because they keep adding new content in the game and adding microtransactions into the game as a way for people to get the new content without having to grind ridiculous hours into the game that majority of people do not have. So most of the people who play these games are not going to experience the new content that's locked in loot boxes because they're not going to put enough time into the game to get everything. So that's why you have a lot of adults. It's not just children, it's also adults that, they put so much money into these games so that they can get this in-game content. And the results work. I mean, these games are continuing to sell, continuing to make money. Look at Grand Theft Auto 5, for example. They just sold 100 million copies. It was announced like a month ago that they reached the 100 million copy milestone. And it's just crazy to think that the same amount of people that bought a PlayStation 1 was one of the best-selling consoles of all time, sold 100 million units. The same amount of people own GTA 5. It's just crazy to think that a game like that is so wildly popular, but that has to do with the games as a service model. The game is staying relevant through new updates, but they offer microtransactions as a way for people to put real money into the game to save time, basically, because it takes way too much time. These games are all grind fests. And personally, I prefer the old days when the games as a service thing was not a thing. I prefer when you just had single player, and even when you did have online multiplayer, and their way of monetizing the game further was maybe through some map packs, DLCs, or even expansions like the Vietnam expansion for Bad Company 2. Completely changed the game. I prefer those days. And I remember back then people were complaining about DLC and were like, oh, DLC shouldn't exist. DLC shouldn't be in any games. I just wish I pay $60 and that's it. But I didn't mind DLC when it added something to the game. Now, the Call of Duty map packs I thought were a total ripoff, but the thing about the industry is companies respond to consumer actions in the long run, right? If people weren't putting ridiculous amounts of money into these games, into the microtransactions, then the games as a service model would not have existed, would not have been a thing. Because you see a lot of people complaining on the internet about the games as a service model, about microtransactions, about loot boxes, but at the end of the day, money talks, bullshit walks, right? Like, look at Fallout 76, for example. I guarantee, despite all the controversy with that game, they are still making money. They are still turning a profit because the Atom Shop, or whatever it's called, is making money. The game still sold fairly well. It sold 1 million retail copies, physical copies for an online-only game. Now, I'm sure they sold far more digital copies than physical. So the game sold more copies than Fallout 3. I know that's not really a huge milestone because that's a 10-year-old game. But this is the point I'm trying to make with this whole thing, is that despite, they're willing to take the PR bullet, because at the end of the day, people put ridiculous amounts of money into these games to the point where it makes no sense to be making single-player games anymore, to just focus entirely on single-player. I mean, Bethesda Game Studios is the perfect example of this, a studio that is known, that is famous for its focus on single-player experiences. Dipping their toes into the games as a service online only model. If that doesn't speak volumes, I don't know what does. But there's a reason why Sony is moving in the opposite direction while other companies are moving towards that direction of monetizing games, releasing fewer games, and just releasing, one game every few years. That's what Ubisoft's doing. They announced they're making fewer games to focus on, their PR reason is, to make the games better, make them last longer, but it's really to just milk the shit out of them. We all know that. And I mean, you're still going to get your Call of Duty games every year, but that's the opposite problem, in my opinion, making too much games. There really needs to be a middle ground. But the games as a service model, it seems like we're getting fewer games. Grand Theft Auto 5. If Grand Theft Auto Online wasn't so wildly successful, I guarantee you we would have had GTA 6 by now. So then why does Sony keep churning out these single-player only, single story-driven, narrative-rich experiences on their console? Well, it's simple. It's because their business model is different from the business model of AAA studios. Right? They need to sell a game as much as possible. And with Sony, it's really about selling as much consoles as possible, not about selling as much games as possible, right? They really don't care about, of course they care about sales. If this game doesn't sell well on the console, like if The Last of Us didn't sell well, then that would be a problem. But they're obviously not focused on making the most money as possible on that game specifically. They're more focused on those sales being offset into people buying consoles. So if they have good exclusives, then people are going to buy the console just for those exclusives. I know so many people, so many PC gamers, I'm sure some of you listening right now are among those PC gamers who don't really consider yourselves heavy console gamers, people who aren't really into console gaming. You're primarily PC gamers, but you see games like The Last of Us, you see games like Spider-Man, and you actually pick up a PS4 to play those games. There are a lot of people like that, and it works. And that's Sony's endgame strategy, is to build up the PlayStation brand as much as possible. It's all about the PlayStation brand. It's not about the games, the individual games themselves. So you just look at the results. Look at the 3 best-selling games on PlayStation 4. So when people say exclusives don't matter, it's a stupid thing. It's a stupid position to take, because look at the 3 best-selling games on the PlayStation 4. Okay, at number 3, God of War, 5 million copies sold. And that game came out this year. It's not even a year old. And it sold 5 million copies, so that's going to continue over time. And then number 2 is Horizon Zero Dawn, 7.6 million copies sold. And then number 1 is Uncharted 4 at 8.7 million units, which is just incredible. So the 3 best-selling games on the PlayStation 4 are, all 3 of them are story-driven, single-player focused experiences, and they're exclusives as well. Uncharted 4 has a multiplayer mode, but I guarantee you, Uncharted, as someone who has played Uncharted for the online, I know that I'm in the minority. The majority of people who play the Uncharted games play it for the single-player experience. That's why they released the Nathan Drake collection years ago without Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3's multiplayer. Their weird excuse was, we don't want to divide the player base. We don't want to release... It was just a stupid excuse. Their excuse was, we don't want to, we're going to remaster Uncharted 1, 2, and 3. Uncharted 1 didn't have multiplayer, but Uncharted 2 and 3 did. We don't want to put multiplayer in Uncharted 2 and 3 remastered for the PS4 because we don't want to divide the player base. We don't want it to be divided between players on the PS3 and PS4, which is a BS excuse, because then why did they remaster The Last of Us and divide the online community between the PS3 and PS4 on those platforms, right? So that was a BS excuse. The real excuse was multiplayer in Uncharted isn't really a hit. You know what I mean? Like, they put it in there, but it's not really as huge as the single player. You know what I mean? Nothing close. So these are 3 story-driven, narrative-rich experiences where story is the focus, single player is the focus, telling a compelling story is the focus, and the results don't lie. These are what indicates that that why Sony is doing this. Besides that these are the best-selling games, it also indicates that, well, because these are the best-selling games, it must be a reason why people buy the console in the first place, right? If these are the best-selling games, you know what I'm saying? Like, if these are the best-selling games on the platform, then that must indicate that a lot of people have bought the platform just for those games, right? So you just look at the results, and it makes total sense why Sony is completely committed to delivering these single-player experiences, because it creates interest in the PlayStation brand. It makes people buy PlayStation 4s instead of Xbox Ones or whatever. Or even people who, consider themselves people who prefer to play games on other platforms, but they're still going to go out and pick up a PS4 because they have games that they cannot play. And that's kind of the same thing with Nintendo. Nintendo's another company, another great example. Another studio that's not really utilizing this games as a service. Well, first of all, they really can't, because their online infrastructure is terrible. And I'm saying that, I'm not trying to incite a platform war or anything, but even the most diehard Nintendo fans will admit that Nintendo has piss poor online infrastructure. They couldn't really support games as a service as we know it. But they're a great example. People buy Nintendo games because of the single player games that they make. So that's really the reason why, while the majority of the industry is moving towards this microtransaction, loot box ridden business model, where pretty much trying to nickel and dime you any chance they can get, and Sony and Nintendo are taking a different approach, because they're really not in the same business as these AAA companies, right? They're in the hardware business. These companies are in the software business. And yes, while the Sony and Nintendo obviously produce software, they are ultimately in the hardware business. And that's really why they're focusing heavily on delivering experiences that stand out from the rest of the crowd, so that you buy their hardware, and that hardware turns into more software sales in the long run, because the PlayStation Store, the Nintendo Store, even the Xbox Live Store, whatever, these are the lifeline of these companies and how they really make money. That's why they sell consoles at a loss. Remember, they sell consoles at a loss. They don't actually make money off of the hardware itself. They make money off of the digital and physical sales that their platform generates. So, ultimately, if you want to know why these companies are focusing on single-player experiences, and they're going in a completely different direction from the rest of the industry, it's because ultimately they're in a different industry, really. I mean, the gaming industry, obviously, but I mean, they're in a different business. So, of course, the business model is going to be different, if that makes any sense.